Well, good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you to this ecoDa Mazars Webinar on sustainability, the impact of the EU Green Taxonomy on bank loans and SMEs. Well, let me just start by introducing the topic. I mean, we all know that there is huge pressure and need for companies, investors, and the banking system to embrace sustainability. And the EU certainly, I think, is attempting to lead in this area through the publication of its Green Taxonomy, which is I suppose the simplest way to describe it is as a classification system which defines sustainable economic activities. And some people have described it as the new gold standard to certify the greenness of business models and activities. Now, initially, all financial companies, large companies and listed companies will need to report against the taxonomy, and that's being phased in this year and next year. But SMEs are initially exempt. But this doesn't mean, I think, that the taxonomy will be irrelevant for SMEs, far from it, particularly given the high level of interdependence of SMEs with large stakeholders. So the question is, for today's session, how might the impact of the taxonomy be felt on SMEs? And are European SMEs ready for this impact? That is the discussion of today, and I'm really delighted to welcome 5 excellent speakers who are going to address this topic from different directions. And what I'm going to do is give each speaker the chance to make some introductory remarks, and then after we've heard from each speaker, we will come through to a Q&A session. And I really do encourage you, as the speakers are speaking, to put your questions into the Q&A box here on the call, and then I can refer to them afterwards. But now, turning to our first speaker, I'm delighted to welcome Maud Gaudray, who is the Global Co-Head of Sustainability at Mazars. Maud, over to you.
Thank you, Roger. Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here with you to talk about this important topic, which is one of the key topics of discussions, with auditors and consultants and their clients these days, especially since the first results of the taxonomy publications are now public. If you will allow me, I will just share one slide that attempts to illustrate what I'm going to describe about the taxonomy. I think it's probably important for everyone to either be told or reminded what the taxonomy is and what it's not, so that my co-panelists can then jump in and add to that. Hopefully you can see my screen, which I will try to make bigger. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic. So just maybe taking one step back to put back the taxonomy into a wider European policy context. Some of you might remember that after the 2015 Paris Agreement, Europe started really building on a huge regulatory momentum with some key elements being part of this. There was obviously the Green Deal, which is the political roadmap of the European Union in terms of what its actual sustainable development goals and objectives are. But once you've set objectives, then you need to start thinking about how you're going to equip the different stakeholders to achieve those objectives. And that was the goal of the 2018 EU Action Plan Financing a Sustainable Growth. And in this package, there were basically 3 key instruments and 3 key objectives, one of which was the taxonomy at the time. And the key objective that the taxonomy serves is to make sure that investors, institutional investors, reorient capital flows toward a more sustainable economy. That was the tagging of the objective and the taxonomy at the time. Concretely, what does it mean? It means that if we want Europe to reach its environmental objectives, then we need to define, and Roger, you said, taxonomy is a classification of sustainable activities. We need to know what is a sustainable activity and what is not. And that's the purpose of the taxonomy. It's basically, it purposefully tagged it a global positioning system because it's what it's meant to be, right? It's a tool to identify what can be labeled green activity, given what we know are the environmental objectives of Europe, mainly on climate, but not only, and on climate deriving from the Paris Agreement. So if without going into the details, you may know that there are 6 environmental objectives framing the policy agenda of Europe in terms of environment. Only 2 of them, the first 2 climate objectives, have been covered by what we call delegated acts. Basically, it's the technical aspects of the taxonomy that allows it to be implemented by the companies and the undertaking in scope. So today we're mainly talking about climate, but soon enough, once the Commission has adopted the recently proposed technical advice of the platform on the other 4 environmental objectives, we'll cover these are the 4. But if we focus on climate and go back to what the taxonomy actually is and how it works, if we're talking about climate, the leading objective is to meet the commitment or to maintain the greenhouse gas emissions at a level that will allow temperature to not increase by more than 1.5 degrees by 2050 in Europe, right? So that's the objective. Once you've said that, then you need to look into which are the sectors and activities that are the most exposed to this transition and to climate-related risks. And you need to assess what needs to be done across those sectors and activities to meet that commitment to cap the temperature rise, right? So the taxonomy has been thought with that in mind to be both a tool to be used by investors to identify those activities that will enable Europe to reach that goal. And it's also a tool to be used by the undertakings themselves to position themselves against the necessary climate transition that we all have to put in place. So concretely, how does it work? The taxonomy is a science base that's important because it's not some whimsical thinking of a bunch of people in a garage. It's been a really profound review of what are the most greenhouse gas emission sectors throughout the European economy, which are the ones who really need to significantly and urgently reduce their emissions. So there was an analysis about who's the most emitting sector and activity. It's also including the most exposed sectors and activities to climate risks. And in the list of sectors that you see covered here, you will also see those that are not only the most emitting ones or the most exposed to climate risks, but also those for which, and this is a very important aspect because it's one of the most important critiques made to the taxonomy, and only those for which today there exists technical solutions to reduce significantly greenhouse gas emissions, right? So not included in the sectors covered by the taxonomy are those sectors that are either not large emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, or those sectors that are not, highly exposed to climate risk, and all of those as well, that's super important, for which, even though they might be, affected by climate risk, but for which today there is no technical solution to either protect them from climate risks, climate-related risks, or to significantly reduce their emissions, which is, one of the critiques made to the taxonomy, that it's a very narrow mapping of sustainable activities for those reasons I just explained. So across those 13 or 14 sectors, behind that, there are between 80 and 90 activities that are currently covered. And those are the sectors and activities where investors have to invest first and urgently. It doesn't mean that these are the only activities they should invest in, but it's the priority list of investments for institutional investors. And for companies, it's a way to identify whether, in case it hasn't been done already, whether they are, part of those activities and sectors that are the most exposed. And if that's the case, then it should bring, the question, what do I need to do? What are the solutions available to me that I might not have considered yet that could either protect me and my operations against climate-related risks? What are the solutions that could help me reduce my greenhouse gas emissions? And also on the positive side, what would be the business opportunities for me to consider and further develop so that my business remains, a relevant and sustainable business in the future, not only from a financial perspective, but also from, a perspective of relevance to a wider economy and expectations from stakeholders. And in that aspect, even though it appears to be a very technical tool, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure, a very difficult one to implement, I think it's first and foremost a useful tool to consider, in a different light, what risks an entity might be exposed to, and to consider potential solutions that it might not have considered so far. So very concretely, what will the taxonomy require from the entities, under its scope? It's basically reporting 3 financial KPIs, right? That will show to what extent, based on a number of technical screening criteria, and I don't want to go into the details, but to what extent a business model of a given company is aligned with what is being considered by the taxonomy as being sustainable activities, right? It gives both the company and its stakeholders, in particular investor, a sense of what could be, potential and future developments towards contributing to the transition and towards contributing to protecting the entity against climate-related risks. And with that, I'll pass it on back to you, Roger, for other perspective on this.
Thank you very much, Maud. And thank you also for that slide. And I'm now going to turn to Nisa Avamaker, who is Senior Policy Advisor at the European Banking Federation. Nisa.
Thank you very much, Roger. And thank you also, Maud, for explaining actually what the taxonomy is, and maybe even more importantly, for explaining what the taxonomy is not. Because this is something that sometimes we are forgetting in really trying to explain the taxonomy. It's really also very important to understand what it is not. Now, looking at the impact of SMEs, given the importance of SMEs to the EU economy, and the fact that 70% of SMEs are relying on banks' funding for the external financing, to understand how taxonomy impacts SMEs, we need to first understand how taxonomy impacts banks' lending, and also how taxonomy impacts large corporates, as SMEs are often part of a larger business ecosystem. But this part I will leave for other speakers. So going a little bit back, when taxonomy was initially developed as a classification system or kind of a dictionary, it was rather very investor-centric. And it was focused on enabling the investors to direct the funds to sustainable activities and also to increase the transparency of investment products. At the very beginning, banks were even concerned about the lack of applicability of the taxonomy to their lending products and to their business for different reasons. Some are still a little bit valid, like data availability or suitability for automatization of the processes. But also they were worried because a large proportion of banks' lending is in fact the so-called general purpose lending. So the taxonomy, as Maud was explaining, is activity-based, but a lot of financing bank lending is actually to finance the day-to-day operation of companies. So there is not necessary and always a project or a concrete activity that the banks are financing. It doesn't mean the banks doesn't know or doesn't evaluate the risk, but it's at entity level. This is a little bit different. And that's why we were concerned, how do you apply the taxonomy to banks lending? This was, of course, at the time when taxonomy was not envisaged mandatory for application in banks. This has, of course, changed. So today, banks have to apply taxonomy for their lending book for disclosure purposes, the so-called green asset ratio. So what is the green asset ratio? Is the proportion of the taxonomy aligned financing activities of banks. So exposures, we have to disclose to which extent exposures of our lending exposures to corporates under the scope of the non-financial reporting directive, later the CSRD, are taxonomy aligned. So it's not without challenges, but it's relatively easy because banks will be relying on the data that are disclosed by the clients. And even we will have to disclose this ratio actually 1 year after the corporation disclosure. So we are starting only in 2024 to disclose the taxonomy alignment. So the concerns are mainly more about the construction of the ratio and not necessarily of course the data will be issue for the customers as well, but it's about the construction. So it's maybe and it's information and decision making value, of course. It may be tempting to look at the green asset ratio as one simple metric, but it will only show a very small proportion of transition efforts of the banks or the companies. This is also what we mentioned, that this is very strict thresholds of the taxonomy. Therefore, probably the green asset ratio will be in one-digit numbers at the beginning. Even to understand the green asset ratio itself, you will have to look at additional metrics to understand what banks are doing and the ratio itself. For example, banks that have, and this is where we come to the SMEs, that have a large exposure to SMEs, or the business model that is focused on the SMEs, will show a lower GAR, the green asset ratio, because the SMEs exposures actually do not count towards the green asset ratio. So it's important to understand the whole balance sheet and the composition of the bank and how this influences the GAR in order to avoid a very simple comparison of any two absolute numbers. Because if we overly are going to focus on this green asset ratio, the taxonomy aligned ratio, it could create in a way a counterproductive disincentive. For example, if you reduce the lending to SMEs, you improve your ratio, but this is not what we are looking for. The European Banking Authority acknowledged this and is therefore proposing that banks are going to also mandatorily disclose another ratio, which is it's called a BETA, which is a banking book taxonomy aligned ratio. And there we are going to have to disclose the taxonomy alignment of SMEs and also non-EU exposures. So it's in the so-called Pillar 3 reporting. This is still needs to be adopted by the Commission, but once it's adopted, it's really a mandatory public disclosure obligation of bank as of June 2024. But how we are going to do, because of course SMEs or non-EU companies are not subject to any disclosure sustainability obligation. So we will have to, the EBA is envisage that banks will collect the taxonomy on a bilateral basis. So going to each and every SME that has an exposure with a bank, asking this information either when we originate the loan or as part of the monitoring process for the existing loans. And only when the information is not available from the SME, and it may not be necessarily due to the non-willingness of giving this information, but basically maybe not an ability to give it, then we can use the estimates as banks. But of course, the use of estimates is also not without issues, because if you don't have the data, it's also very difficult to come with a reliable estimates. So the first years of reporting, we expect really that there will be a lot of caveats on the exposures. But now to my main point, there are 21 million micro and SMEs in the EU. They represent more than 99% of all non-financial enterprises. So the bilateral data collection will represent a huge operational efforts. And I can imagine, and probably we will hear later from Gerhard, that also from SMEs' point of view, it would be of their interest to minimize the number of times that SMEs approach for bilateral engagement for the information. Therefore, the availability of maybe a simplified voluntary reporting standard for SME as soon as possible would be an asset. It's not only about compliance, there might be also benefit for the reporting processes that can drive performance or improve reputation or even access to finance, because of course it will accelerate the lending process. However, having said that, we have to also keep in mind that of that 21 million companies, 93% are actually micro enterprises. They're employing less than 10 people. So we therefore need to really find a balance between cost and benefits, between the efforts and the usefulness of the information, and between the needs on one side and the feasibility on the other side. And for that, we really need to talk to each other and define a limited number of key performance indicators that would meet the need of the financial sector, and at the same time, they would be feasible for SMEs. And this is where I believe also Afra will play a key role. And as I said, we have to be very practical and distinguish between what is essential and what will be nice to have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denisa, and thanks for that thinking perspective and raising many, many interesting questions, which I'm sure we'll come back to. So now I would like to introduce Alexandra Afra, who is a member of the platform on sustainable finance at Business Europe. Alexandra.
Thank you and good morning. Yeah, I'm indeed member of the Sustainable Finance Platform, but I'm firstly Deputy Director General at Business Europe, and I will be speaking mainly as representing Business Europe, which is representing European business at large. I mean, a lot has been said already by Maud and Denisa. I will try to highlight maybe some of the points they have already mentioned or complement from our perspective, and then also talk about SMEs. And I think then it will be a good link with Gerhard, who will be, I'm sure, going deeper into the SMEs. So from my perspective, I think the first point to highlight is we know there is a huge need for investments in the Green Deal transformation or transition, let's call it like this, and we do think that the taxonomy, as it was said before, has a potential and can be a very useful tool to support investments going into this transformation. So I think this is where we all converge, I hope, in this discussion. We do see the potential of the taxonomy to be a very helpful instrument. As it was said, I think we should keep in mind that this is an instrument which has been developed firstly for the financial sector, and with a certain logic, bringing this classification to the financial sector. I think in the design of the instrument, there maybe hasn't been a lot of attention about the usability of the instrument for the economy at large and the real economy as well. And we see now, while we are in the implementation phase of the taxonomy, we see a number of challenges emerging, and in terms of usability of the taxonomy, and many of them can be solved and will be solved, but it's a learning by doing exercise. So there is a need as well to give it its time to deal with the numerous challenges that are implementation challenges that are appearing with the taxonomy. I think as well, it's important to keep in mind that the taxonomy, at least in our view, has been developed as a positive instrument. So this is an instrument which is expected to bring more investments into the economy, more investment into sustainable activities, but we are talking about a positive approach, bringing more investments. And I'm mentioning this because we really don't expect the taxonomy to be or to become a punitive instrument, which would then become an instrument, a classification, a dictionary, whatever name we put to disinvest in activity. We don't think this is the logic and the rationale behind the instrument. And I wanted to stress this as well. We also think, like many of us, I suppose, but this is still a quite new instrument. If I may say, the puzzle of developing this taxonomy is not complete yet. Delegated acts still have to be tabled. We have to gain from the reporting phase. So I'm mentioning this because from our perspective, it's important to let the taxonomy being implemented, make big effort in the implementation of the current system, and gain experience from the current system step by step. Also, hopefully learning step by step how this is impacting investment flows, because this is for that reason that the taxonomy has been designed, is to have an impact on channeling investment. So let's gain experience in the implementation and how it is going to impact investment. So that's also something we should keep in mind. And the other one is, I have two more points on the general framework. The other one is about the complexity. I think someone mentioned this one. I mean, I think it's important not to undermine or not to underestimate, the complexity of the instrument. The combination of the significant contribution criteria together with the DNSH, do not significant harm criteria. The fact that this is, as it was said before, this is not just about climate, this is about the 6 environmental objective, and you need to combine substantial contribution, DNSH, for the 6 environmental objectives. And you have as well all the reporting layer under the taxonomy. So just to mention these few, when you combine all of this, and when you have to implement the taxonomy at entity level, it's a highly complex exercise, and really not to underestimate, and also to give it its time to be properly implemented. And the very final point, as a general consideration, I wanted to highlight and for everyone to have in mind is, as I said in the beginning, the taxonomy we do think has a real potential, and we do believe in the instrument, but we should keep in mind that it's not an instrument and nothing else around. In Europe, we have a very densely regulated environment. It's on sustainability as well, and environmental sustainability. So the articulation between the taxonomy and all the other legislations about sustainability is a tricky exercise as well, and how you make them mutually beneficial, but how you also minimize the overlaps and possible contradictions between some of these legislative instruments. So they are just general considerations, but I feel important to put in the debate from my perspective. I finish with just the point about industry, large companies, SMEs. I think it's clear that the taxonomy, like in its current form, does not cover SMEs. but there are indirect impact, of course. It was mentioned by Denisa from the bank perspective. I think as well, because the industrial ecosystem in Europe, like in many other places, you have a strong connection, obviously, between the large and the smaller companies. So what is going to impact large companies will obviously indirectly impact smaller companies. So this industrial ecosystem is really key there, and I'm sure Gerhard will develop more on this. My final point here is, I think, indirect impact on SMEs, not to underestimate again, is we see the taxonomy, the DNSH criteria principle being more and more injected in European instruments, funding instruments, like the recovery plan, like some research innovation funding schemes. So if the taxonomy is used in European policy instruments, funding instruments, then they might, and there will certainly be an impact as well on SMEs, and this is something to reflect on, I believe. So I'll leave it there for my intro, Roger, and happy for the debate further on.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and your points about complexity, I think, are very well made. But if I can encourage people to pose questions for our Q&A using the Q&A box. But in the meantime, I'm delighted to move on to Gerhard Humer, who is Economic Policy Director at SME United. Gerhard.
Thank you, Roger, and welcome to all of you. So as Alexandra has said, I will now try to elaborate a little bit more on all the things have already been said, but more from an SME point of view. Denisa already pointed to the fact that from the 22 million SMEs at European level, 93% are micro enterprises and 50% of them are single person companies. Most of them don't even do financial reporting and of course have no experience with any kind of sustainability reporting so far, with some exemptions which now in the supply chain have to help large companies to do their non-financial reporting, which exists already as regards the corporate social responsibility subject. However, we have to be clear that SMEs are very much aware that they also have to contribute to the sustainability transition and to the green transition. The latest report from the European Commission on the Eurobarometer says that 89% of all SMEs are already doing something to become greener. Even we are all aware it's not enough. What we also see from the investment surveys done by the European Investment Bank is that the biggest barrier for SMEs to get greener is uncertainty about the regulatory environment. Then it comes the costs of the adaptation. Then it comes the lack of skills, etc. Financing is only number 5 in this risk of barriers. So there, SMEs at the moment are not mainly concerned about financing or access to finance. They are more concerned about the overall how it costs, but also they have no clarity in which direction they should develop. And as long as they don't have a clear view about or a certainty about if you invest at the moment in a car, in a new oven for a bakery, that you can run this investment the next 5-7 years, you don't do it. And this clarity is super important, and the taxonomy may also give information about which direction is going and which criteria should be fulfilled and what is possible and what is already available. Therefore, in general, SMEs are not only aware that they have to do the transition, they are also from the very beginning, we always have supported the principal idea of the taxonomy to create an instrument which gives clear information to the market, to the investment market, but also to the lending market, etc., financial institutions, what is green, what is not green, to avoid greenwashing, etc., and to grow this business. However, in the meantime, we see a lot of problems coming up, which are, of course, related to this complexity, what was already mentioned twice by my colleagues. So, from a very simple point of view, at the moment we say, okay, taxonomy is not really highly relevant for SMEs because we are not, banks cannot include SMEs in their green asset ratio, and therefore they only can do it extra reporting if an SME voluntarily says, yes, we want to do it. However, next to the fact that this voluntary reporting will play an important role, not only because an SME would like to have also access to green finance, but mainly also coming from the supply chain, what Alexandra has said, that if an SME supplies to a large company which has to do the taxonomy reporting, and they also will need information from their suppliers, especially from those companies which have activities which are relevant for the taxonomy. However, there's still the taxonomy approach is a positive approach in its logic. It should support green finance. It should create a market for green finance and shouldn't be penalizing those companies which are not able, willing, or have not the capacity to do anything towards taxonomy reporting. The problem we see is that next to this taxonomy reporting in the narrower sense, and it is not as easy as Denisa has said, because for them, say taxonomy reporting is not that much a problem, because taxonomy reporting means we get the figures about taxonomy alignment and taxonomy eligibility, and then we put the figures in our reporting. The problem for SMEs and big companies too, in reality, is how to prove that you are taxonomy aligned. And this is super complex, as Alexandra has said. We have to prove that you are make a significant contribution to one of these 6 goals. This can be in some cases easy, in some cases it's quite complex to prove that you do a significant contribution. And then you have also to prove that you do no significant harm and you do no and you fulfill the social minimum safeguards. And this is for an SME super complicated, because how you prove these things. And then the whole taxonomy in the narrower sense, but we are not very much afraid, because taxonomy related finance will be a very small part of the whole financial business in the next years. But this is overlaid by other developments. Denisa already mentioned it, that banks have to do also reporting on the sustainability of their SME lending portfolios, which means they also will ask additional information which are not 100% related to taxonomy. There are maybe other questions, because they have to prove that their portfolio is sustainable, and not if there are some green activities financed by an SME behind them. Especially the problem with the general purpose lending was also mentioned by Denisa. The second point is that we see now, and Alexandra referred to them, we have other public programs. We have the Recovery and Resilience Facility with the national recovery plans. We have the InvestEU program. And in reality, if you look into them in detail, they are asking for different criteria than the taxonomy criteria, when they have to prove that they are financing some green or sustainable projects with their money. And all this doesn't fit really together at the moment. And this requirements coming from the sustainable finance reporting, requirements coming from the future corporate sustainability reporting, requirements coming from InvestEU, and the taxonomy that is not harmonized here, I think the Commission, there are different units in the Commission, they are working not successfully or in a way together to ensure here some coherence in their work. And therefore, the big challenge for us will be to create with these future voluntary reporting standards, where Maud is working on with my colleagues, that to create something which is sufficient for the reporting towards the banks to help them to fulfill their reporting requirements on the sustainability of bank lending portfolios. It has to be sufficient for larger companies that they can do their corporate sustainability reporting. And it should be, in the best case, also good enough to prove taxonomy alignment for SMEs in a narrower sense. And it should be good enough to help SMEs to provide the needed information when they want to have access to green programs financed by the InvestEU program or by the recovery programs, etc., etc. So this finding the right balance here, it will be the biggest challenge for us, and we are not there. We are not there. We are not understanding what the banks really need from us. We are not understanding really what big business want to have from us, and we are not in a situation to know already how to prove the compatibility with the existing technical criteria putting forward in the taxonomy regulation in a way that is doable for the majority of SMEs in a cost-efficient way, which is not keeping them out of the whole system and pushing them away from the sustainability process. And therefore, it is very good that we have a little bit more time till the review of the delegated act on the taxonomy reporting, where the Commission has to look into more in detail how and if it is feasible for SMEs and how we will continue this process. Thank you for the moment.
Thank you very much indeed. And now let me turn to our final speaker, and that is Raitis Ambrazavicius, who is a board member of ecoDa and also president of the Baltic Institute of Corporate Governance. So, Raitis, I think you're going to give us a board perspective on these matters.
Thank you very much, Roger. Hello, everyone. I prepared one slide actually to talk about this. So when we hear someone talking about EU taxonomy, we usually hear the words must, obliged, meet criteria, comply, to be aligned, and all other kind of frightening expressions. However, I want to take a wider view and to discuss how the company and its board should look at this issue and what it can do in order to benefit the company, its shareholders, and other stakeholders. So let's discuss 9 key points that I listed on the next slide. And the very first is the navigator with certain key tasks. I would like just you to remind that the board is a navigator of the company and it has certain key tasks. I just want to remind 4 of them. So the first is oversight of risk. The second one, the guiding the strategy and setting strategic goals. The third one, safeguarding the company's reputation. And the fourth, the creation of the long-term value. So when we are talking about the taxonomy, actually it's a much wider scope of the activities that the board and the company has to take care and to engage in itself. My second key point is about the current ultimate task for the board. And my opinion is that this current ultimate task is to direct the company towards new opportunities and a new way of value creation for the shareholders and the society. Some time ago, all companies were concentrated on generating return on shareholders' investment. However, today it is not enough. And that is why the boards should take this lead and make the necessary changes. And I admit, and I see that in real life on the boards, that this task will really not be easy for the majority of the companies. Doesn't matter the size of the company, is it a large company or is it SME? My third point is about the financing of the company that is different now, because some time ago, it was only the task for CFO and maybe with the help of CEO, but it's not anymore. And it's not only about the quality of the business plan and the collateral and all other some kind of details. It is about a new business mentality throughout the entire organization. How the business is run today, and the last element, that the board should take the leadership here in not only the introducing itself in the financing issues of the company, but changing this mentality throughout the organization. Now let's go to the number 4, a key powerful tool for the change. At the 24th European Corporate Governance Conference in Helsinki, held at the very end of 2019, it was a kind of last days before the start of pandemics. It was stated that in Europe, we are talking about sustainability related issues for 40 years already, but there is a little progress. And the situation, particularly with environment, became even worse. So it means that companies with their management, boards and owners did not see the benefit to switch to sustainability. Seems that now companies will have more motivation to make necessary hit, and EU taxonomy is one of the key powerful tools to make this change in how the company operates and behaves. And I think that the faster the companies will move towards it, the better their future will be. Okay, so let's go to number 5. Much wider than just compliance. Going green is not only one element of compliance, one more of elements of compliance. Board has to take it deeper and wider by analyzing new appearing risks and opportunities, taking long-term strategic view on how to change the company's strategy, reviewing and updating the long-term goals, and to redirect company's activities. And only then we will see the real big changes. Okay, let's go to number 6, board's leadership in directing the change. I think that the board's duty is a long-term view, and it must take the lead in reshaping the business model and behavior of the company to meet the expectations of the lenders, and not only the lenders, but all the relevant stakeholders of the company. And it's also a very challenging task for the board, once again. And let's go to number 7, building global competitiveness. The board should not forget about the aspects related to the global competitiveness of the company, taking into consideration green regulation, so-called, with the aim and thinking about the other parts of the world. Because we know that other regions or other even continents, they do not care about so much about the green. And in such a cases, the production costs in other regions of the same products would be lower. So green funding, as we know, is having lower costs. However, the green technologies not always are cheaper. Usually they are more expensive than kind of traditional ones. So the board should direct the company towards a new business model in order not only to maintain competitiveness, but to discover new ways of sustainable competitive advantage on the global scale. And let's go to the next, the greenwash. I believe that we saw a lot of, I wanted to say good examples, but of course, these are not good examples about the greenwash, especially on the reporting side. All attempts that will be not at the core of the company operations, and all this greenwashing is condemned to fail, not even in the long term, but in the short term. Some time ago, we were talking that it's a kind of, you will fail in the long term. I believe that you will fail also in the short term already. So here the shareholders and investors, not only the boards, should take care and be very attentive what they want from the company, what the board they are nominating, what expectations they're raising towards the company and the board and so on. So this is not only, I want to emphasize that this is not only the task for the board, and shareholders have nothing to do with that, not exactly. And we are going to the last point, number 9, the transparency and accountability. The board should not forget one more important set of responsibilities: the transparency, accountability, and reporting. Openness about what is done and what is going to be done is very important, not only in the attracting green financing, but in every single aspect of the company's operations, in developing its competitiveness, in strengthening and the same time safeguarding its reputation, in increasing its social role. In this way, favorable financing will be more attainable because of trust and predictability of the company. And stronger competitiveness as well as increased value will follow. So this change should be not made just because of EU taxonomy, what I want to emphasize. This change should be made because of the future of your company. So the company, the management, the board, and the shareholders especially, they have to take very seriously into this topic into consideration. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rytis. And I thank you now to all the speakers. I think we've covered a lot of ground. And speaking from UK, sadly no longer part of the EU, but I do know that in October of last year, the UK government committed to developing a very similar taxonomy for UK green finance. So I'm sure that any UK viewers will be watching this discussion with great interest. But let me start. I'd like to put my initial question to Maud, and please other speakers do feel free to come in on this question if you'd like to as well. But Maud, you know, you were making the point that in some respects the taxonomy is quite limited. It only covers actually at the moment a limited number of activities. But yet we've heard from other speakers that actually the taxonomy is very complex. It's going to be very difficult to actually apply this in practice. I just wonder how you resolve those two forces. Do you think the taxonomy will need to get more comprehensive, or will it actually need to be simplified in order to be workable?
That's a super tricky question you're asking, Roger. But it's a very important one. There's no magic solution. I think it's two different objectives that we're trying to reconcile. I think ideally, the taxonomy would need to be simplified in the way it is implemented, but it should also include more activities and sectors so that we don't leave huge part of the European economy unfinanced by institutional investors and banks, because they're not tagged, as being green as seen by the taxonomy, because there are huge transition needs also for those sectors that either do not have significant, negative impact on the environment, which is why they're not covered today by the existing taxonomy, but they would still need to upbring their environmental performance. And there's value in this, right? It's because it's resilience against climate risks for everyone. And it's also another way to create value on a larger scale. So really not leaving those sectors and activities that are not covered today behind would be a mistake. But it is true that if the extension of the taxonomy, and by the way, the platform just released its final report, its technical advice to the Commission as to how and why it would make sense to extend the current taxonomy to more sectors and activities. And I think the platform actually put it, black on white. It says we do need to extend the taxonomy, but we also need to consider, the already well acknowledged difficulty of implementation, and find a way to simplify that implementation part so that we don't leave more companies behind, including obviously SMEs. So I think that there's a common agreement that we need to resolve both challenges. I'm not quite sure that anyone has the magic solution as to how we're going to achieve those two objectives.
Denisa, just one thing which struck me as I was listening to you. I mean, doesn't this whole taxonomy just create a huge incentive to divert financing towards larger companies rather than smaller companies? Isn't that a huge problem?
I wouldn't say so. If you look at, and Gerhard also provided the numbers, like the 99% of companies are SMEs, 50% of the GDP is relying on the SMEs. We can't think about the transition of the EU economy without thinking of the SMEs or actually ignoring them. So I don't think so. And also, like when you look at the banks, that I was before really concentrating on explaining the the impact of taxonomy and the mandatory disclosure obligation of banks on the SMEs, trying to make the point that basically people have to ask these questions. But it's not only what we have to do. And it's not only the taxonomy. Of course, the bank's about like managing the risk. And we will have to start counting and considering the ESG risk into the risk management framework and supervisory framework. And we know that more even rules are coming, but it's also in the interest of the banks to manage both the physical and the transition risk. So we need to understand from companies, and I think there will not be differentiating whether the company is small or big. What are the risks that let's say just climate or sustainability in general has on the company, both again physical or risk of changing regulation, not willingness or ability to adapt to the business model. So we have to understand the risk because their risk are our risk, and we also need to understand what is the impact of the company to the environment and it's to society. And again, I don't think we will be distinguishing, the banks will be distinguishing whether it's a big company or small company. Of course, the question is, how if you have to go to some metrics or something, like how we find a way to get this information from smaller companies without overburdening them, or being as practical as possible. But we will need to assess and evaluate the risk and impact. And also, many banks are committing their portfolios to align with the Paris Agreement. In fact, you can't do that without understanding where your clients are. So, because of course, it depends on your financing decision. So you can say like, okay, I'm divesting from this and that, but that's not necessarily the way the banks want to go. They are not abandoning the clients, they are looking at, so if the client can transition and is willing to transition, they are developing a lot of like financing tools. And again, no distinguishing whether it's SME or a big company in this sense. Of course, there might be different financial instruments or financial products that fit the different needs. So this will be the thing we need to maybe, and even going now away from taxonomy, maybe more important than to understand where the company currently is to understand where the company is going. And this is why, you know, Maud already mentioned the transition taxonomy, but even if you leave that apart, maybe the transition plans of companies, maybe at company level, not necessarily the activity level, it's going to be really important for banks.
Yes.
I hope that's what the question.
Yes, absolutely. Alexandra, do you think the taxonomy is really going to significantly support the green transition? I mean, it was mentioned in the comments that companies will only start reporting on this from 2024. So, you know, is it going to have a fast enough impact to actually make a difference here, given the crisis we're facing?
Okay, thank you, Roger. I'll come to your question. Maybe I react as well on what has been said before, or on a few things, and I think it will bring logically to your question. So I think the last point by Denisa about where companies are going. And the future, that's I think an important element which I understand. The taxonomy will give the possibility to report CapEx plan for the next 5 up to 10 years. So the current taxonomy gives this space for companies to report about the future. So this will have to be considered. The challenge we have is, and this is a link to what was said as well by Ritis about the global competitiveness, the transparency. Yes, we need transparency, but I think it's important to understand that from a company perspective, real economy, we also need sufficient safeguard to protect sensitive, confidential business information. If the companies put on the market, in the public, all kind of information about how they are going to transform in the next 5, 10, 15 years, it basically gives to the public and to the global competitors what is the business model of the companies. And I think that's something where we need certain limits in what is to be made public at large, what is going to be made public for the investors community, which needs to make some assessment of the market at large, but also what needs to be kept in a one-to-one discussion between the investor and the investee, and then better protect under confidentiality. So I think here this is extremely key. We don't mix everything here. We really need to protect business from not being forced to disclose all their business plans to the global competitors. We will otherwise be losing stronger sets in terms of our global competitiveness. And then I think I would agree with Maud about the taxonomy needs to further develop. We need to bring more activities under the taxonomy. This is an ongoing process. As we said, there will be soon the new delegated act with the 4 other environmental objectives. It will bring more economic activities under the taxonomy, where we have clear reservations as Business Europe. And you understand I have 2 hats. I have being member of the Sustainable Finance Platform, which is a group of experts which came to a report last week about the extension of the taxonomy. But I have also my Business Europe hat. And here we do have clear reservations about the extension of the taxonomy beyond the green. and going into amber, red category, etc. Here, I think this is not the moment to do it. As I said, we need to gain experience on how this taxonomy is working, which has elements of being also a dynamic instrument. It's not just a static instrument, the taxonomy as it is now. Years by years, it will bring a picture of the evolution of companies in its current form. But going for an extension of the taxonomy will bring additional cost, will bring more complexity, will bring reputational risk on companies, which is against the positive approach that we think needs to be kept under the taxonomy. So all of this being said, to your last point, I think, well, it's never going fast enough. I think we can all agree that we should do always much faster. But I do believe, and we do believe, that there is a clear transition that is ongoing in the business community. And I think the instruments that we have in place today will facilitate the further acceleration of what is already happening.
Rightis, do you want to come in here?
Yes, actually, Alexander, pointed very important, issue about this openness that I was talking, and everyone is actually talking about that, and this, competitiveness or losing the competitiveness because of that. So quite often I hear from the boards the very simple question: so how much we should kind of disclose? So my recommendation always is very simple, that disclose almost everything except what can hurt you as a company. So everything what you think that can hurt you, either in the short or long term, you should not disclose. It's your secrets, and you should actually, as a board, make a list of your confidential information. But the more you will explain what are you doing and how are you doing and so on, that is not secret. So the better your kind of visibility all over the markets will be. I'm talking about the attraction of the talents. If you are not talking what are you doing and how are you doing, why employees or talents are going to come to your company to work for? So I believe that every one of us see that those companies that are talking, they're attracting the talents much easier than others. Then the same about the customers, absolutely, communications and so on, and the same about the investors. But it's absolutely not talking about the confidential or sensitive information. Thank you.
Gerhard, there should be an incentive for SMEs to find a way to demonstrate their greenness, so that they can tap in to the finance, which is aligned with the taxonomy. But I just wonder how in practice they can do this. I wonder if you have any suggestions or ideas around that. I mean, should it be, for example, banks that should be helping them through this process? Do SMEs need perhaps some kind of certification or accreditation process which they can fulfill, which will allow them to demonstrate their alignment? Just wonder what your thoughts are.
No, but you're right. These are some of the directions our considerations are going. The one side, I am here on the side of Alexandra. We should be very careful with fast extension of the taxonomy, the coverage of the taxonomy, because not only because we have first to test if this what we have now works. And working on the platform with the usability group, mainly we see even for large companies and for large accountancy companies and consultants, there are hundreds of open questions where the Commission is working with the platform to give answers, how to really implement them, how to do the reporting in a proper way, etc., etc. There's so many open questions, and we have really to test what we have at the moment before we think about enlargement. The second thing is, I think the start of the taxonomy was really going in the direction saying, let's look into those activities which are most harmful for for the sustainability and for the climate risk, etc., etc. And therefore, I think bringing money in these sectors first and not in the others, which have also an impact but not as much impact, is also a good approach. For SMEs, I think, of course, there should be the possibility to prove that your company is taxonomy aligned if an SME wanted to have access to green finance. This is on the one side of the technical criteria, one possibility, and in the climate mitigation, it would work. You can take rather simple technical criteria about what is the CO2 emission for a car, etc., etc. In other cases, this is a little bit more difficult, but you use environment certificates, using permits, using labelings as a proxy to prove that you are taxonomy aligned is a good way. The same is with the minimum safeguards and with the do no significant harm. I think in most of the cases, we could work with the assumption that if you are only active in the European Union and you fulfill the legal requirements, you fulfill the collective bargaining agreements, etc., etc., that you can work on the assumption that you are doing no significant harm and you are fulfilling the minimum social safeguards. As long as there are not specific reasons to put this into doubt because you are dealing with diamonds or whatever, with importing clothes from Bangladesh, then you may have a second look. But normally it should be sufficient to work under this assumption. But for the really transition point of view, I think working together with accountants or tax advisors on the one side and with the banks to try to identify their own sustainability risks and to see together with the banks how you could adapt to become more sustainable, to reduce the risk also from the bank's point of view, is a super important contribution which can come from this discussion without doing formal big reporting to the outside world. Because alone, if you have to prove to the bank that your business is sustainable, is a step in the right direction. But never forget, the bank will not give you a loan only because you are sustainable. You also have to be competitive, otherwise the banks will not give you money. Yes. And then we have to put this in the bigger context, just in one sentence. We are also working at the moment on this industrial strategy on the transition to a green and more digital economy. And this discussion about the pathways to the future in the different ecosystems also provides a lot of guidance to the SMEs, how they can develop in their digital and sustainable future.
Question for Maud and writers, perhaps. How do you think boards can really mobilize this as actually a tool of competitive advantage? So not something that is about compliance, but something that they can use in a strategic sense, in a positive sense for the business.
I will let Ritis complete because he's in the right seat, but you know, based on the discussions that I can have and I've had in the recent past with boards on this, I think it's, and Ritis already mentioned it, the taxonomy shouldn't be looked at as a compliance exercise, even though it's an imperfect, you know, framework and tool at the moment. If everyone contributes to, you know, giving feedback, it will improve. There's, you know, a lot of good elements to be considered at board level to really look at the business strategy, the business models and the risks, right? Because we're talking about risks to begin with, in a different way, in a way that we're not used to looking at those new you know, sorts of risks. And I think, you know, just moving aside and looking at either a new family of risks or something that we're already used to looking at from a different perspective is always adding value to the discussions at board level. And I think this is how boards should look at the taxonomy, not at the end result, which at the end of the day is reporting, on a few ratios, but really, okay, what does it tell me in terms of how I could look at my business model, risks and opportunities in a different way, and where and how can I draw value from this exercise beyond just complying with this?
Yes.
Ritus, you might want to add something on this.
No. No. Okay, Ritus. We'll move on. Lisa, is the taxonomy now dominating the way in which banks look at sustainability with their clients, or are there other criteria or other sort of sustainability issues which beyond the taxonomy which are of interest to banks?
Yes, thanks. Of course, as Gerhard said, in the first place, if something is taxonomy aligned, doesn't mean it's less risky. If something is not taxonomy aligned, doesn't mean it's more risky. So it's always the risk perspective that is driving the lending decision. And of course, the risk, you may look at that if it's taxonomy or not. Taxonomy is new, so right now you won't find any taxonomy related products in a wide way in the market. But in the future, it might be that I'm always going back to this transition, because what is the green will be, let's say it's 10%, but we also have to look at the 90% and look at the 90% of what in the 90% is still very good, is able to transition somewhere, and what probably is the maybe a much smaller percentage of where probably might be more risky, or there is no way to transition right now, but it doesn't still mean that if a company has a 10% of these activities, that a company as a whole is risky as such. And also, let's be very careful not to penalize, and I think that's what Alexandra was saying, the companies that actually are able to transition, are able to move. So let's not kill them before they actually can do something. So this is very important, and this is all the regulation needs to actually be very sensitive to this, that we actually don't deprive those companies from the chances to change. So again, taxonomy may be a tool. I may be looking at a client that is not taxonomy aligned, but it's taxonomy eligible, so it has activities within taxonomy. And I will look and design a product. It could be a sustainability linked loans that are actually gaining importance in the market. I will say, I will link the loan and the price of the loans and the interest rate to the company achieving certain goals. And this goal may be taxonomy linked or may not be taxonomy linked. So again, they will be, many banks right now are not really looking at a company's activities. Of course, I think like the company is the sum of its activities, but they are looking at company level. So they are already, for example, like this science-based target initiative with some possibility of certification. So they look if the company is this or that certified at the company level, they consider the business model of the company and the transition plan of the company reliable, credible. This is a kind of a transition finance. So the transition finance is much broader than just the taxonomy. And of course, we will have to see, and we will still have to have a discussion about the new report. We have been always saying we need also some framework, because we have greenwashing. We don't want to come to a tax transition washing as well. So we have to have also some maybe a playing field where we will say, okay, these are still the activities that maybe not substantially contribute, but they do contribute. So to answer your question very simply, there is more than the taxonomy, and there will always be more than the taxonomy.
Lisa, do you think that there are this taxonomy can be gained? That there are going to be people out there who are, sophisticated people who are going to basically try to game the system in the taxonomy by getting access to green finance. Do you think that will be easy to do?
Sorry, because I had a bad connection. I didn't understand all the
how easy do you think it is for people potentially to game the system? People who use the taxonomy to gain access to green finance, but who are not actually genuinely green companies.
Well, it will be more difficult with the taxonomy, obviously, to be taxonomy aligned without trying to, because there are clear criteria. Of course, and they are quite strict, and there is also this do no significant harm that, as Gerhard was saying, it needs to be proved. There should be, for big companies, there is also an assurance of those reports. So I think it will be rather hard to greenwash the taxonomy.
Very good. Alexandra, just wonder what you think some of the short implementation challenges are going to be in terms of implementing the taxonomy.
Yeah, so this is a good question. I think this is maybe a link with what was said before by Maud as well. I think definitely compliance is not enough, and companies have to go beyond compliance, be it the taxonomy or other regulations. And I think many companies are reflecting on this. Was a good example given by Gerhard about these transition pathways. I don't know if many knows about this. I hope it's not too much a Brussels bubble tool, but this is a very interesting tool which has a very long-term dimension, and for SMEs and larger companies can really be used, and then for all the ecosystem, including the investors, can be used to see the long-term transition by a sector, and then by companies part of the sector. So I think more and more companies are engaging into this. Definitely. I mean, I start having a bit of experience how things work European-wide when it comes to business, and I think many companies are going definitely beyond compliance and into the long-term planning, and when it comes to sustainability. This is for me quite obvious. But that being said, yeah, compliance is a challenge, and this is where the implementation of this taxonomy in terms of cost, in terms of again, Gerhard was mentioning there are hundreds or thousands of unanswered questions yet at the moment about how the taxonomy has to be implemented. When it comes to eligibility, there are a lot of uncertainties about definitions, what should fall under the scope or not of an activity. There are questions about the definition of OPEX. I mean, it's one of the KPIs. There is no full clarity how there is an indicative list, but there is no clarity about the expenditure that could fall under this OPEX definition. This is just about the first step of reporting about eligibility. Then when it will be about next year for the alignment, here as well, we see with the first delegated act, big question of definition, like substance of concerns. This is something which is used in the NSH. There is no clear-cut definition what this is about. So I think the costs of complying with the taxonomy today and the many open questions about implementing the taxonomy, so overall about the compliance is a challenging one. I think we all have to work to make it work, but it's not an easy exercise, and yeah, much more work needs to be done. Definitely.
Yes. We're approaching the end of the session now, but I do have now a final question, which is initially for you, Gerhard. Feel free to tip in. It seems to me from what you've been saying that there's a key challenge is raising awareness of this amongst SMEs, that at the moment SMEs, they don't really know about it, they don't know how to deal with it. There's a real kind of knowledge and awareness issue. I mean, how do you think we can raise that awareness amongst European SMEs?
I'm not fully agree that this is a question of awareness. The companies are aware that there are changes ahead of them. The big problem is how to start tackling this transition. And as I said in the very beginning, one of the issues is they need to know better where the way is going. But you can expect from a large enterprise that they, from the board, they will sit together and say, we are defining the way how to continue. But if you are one of 20,000 bakeries in a country, you cannot expect that every one of the 20,000 baker, the owner of these bakeries, are defining their own future. This has to be done in a much more coherent way, involving the business organization, involving the suppliers to these companies, offering them new technical possibilities, developing the technologies for sectors, etc., etc. So these are a lot of elements, and financing is only one aspect of them. And from my point of view, at the moment, not the most important one. They are struggling to say where I should take the employees which have the know-how to do this, where should I take, where will I get the technology, where will I get the regulatory certainty about my way forward, etc., etc. And these are the elements where we have to look in. And the last point is, we are, of course, we see it in the practice. For example, if it's about energy efficiency, it's not only that SMEs need a kind of public finance to invest in this energy efficiency, otherwise there will be too much crowding out of normal investments. But all programs we are looking into show that it is not enough to give them public loan to do the energy efficiency investment. You need also provide them with the needed advice to help them to design the project. And without these advisory services, the majority of SMEs will not be able to start this transition.
Yes. Well, thank you. And I'm afraid we're out of time now, but I just want to thank all of the speakers, Brightis, Alexandra, Denise, Maud and Gerhard. Thank you so much for your insights. I mean, certainly what I suppose I conclude from this is that on the one hand, this taxonomy is a big step forward for Europe and actually for policy more generally in its attempt to define, what is green and what isn't green. But it's still a work in progress, at least in terms of its implementation and its impact. And there's still some way to go to work out how we actually realize the full potential actually of this taxonomy in the European business system. So I want to thank you all very much, and thanks to the listeners, and I hope to see you again on a future ecoDa or Mazars webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.